The sound of the slap arrived before I even understood what had happened. It cracked through the ballroom like a whip, sharp enough to cut straight through the string quartet, straight through 300 conversations, straight through 25 years of pretending everything was fine. For one long second, nobody moved. The musicians froze mid-note. A waiter near the bar stopped pouring, and champagne spilled quietly over the rim of a glass onto the white tablecloth. My cheek burned so fiercely that the ringing in my ears drowned out almost everything else. Almost, but not quite. I could still hear 300 people not saying a word. My husband, Richard, didn't look ashamed. He looked inconvenienced, the way a man looks when a minor mechanical problem has interrupted something important. As I said, his voice carried easily across the ballroom, pitched just loud enough that no one in the back could claim they'd missed it. Either apologize to my mother or get out. Beside him, his mother Margaret pressed one hand to her chest in a show of delicate horror. But I knew that face too well after 25 years. Underneath the performance, she was satisfied. She'd wanted this moment for a long time, and now she finally had it, in front of everyone who mattered to her. I looked around the room slowly. Some relatives couldn't meet my eyes. Others didn't bother trying. They watched with open curiosity, the way people watch an accident they know they shouldn't enjoy. One of Richard's business partners let out a short laugh into his scotch, as if this were simply an amusing turn in the evening's entertainment. 25 years of marriage had brought me here, to this ballroom, to this moment, to the taste of my own blood where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. I touched my face slowly. My hand was steady. I wasn't crying yet. Instead, I let my eyes travel over the room Richard had insisted on, the Palmer House Hilton, downtown Chicago, chosen because it photographed beautifully and said the right things about a man's success. Crystal chandeliers threw soft light across round tables draped in white, each one crowded with fresh roses that must have cost more than my first car. Behind the dance floor, a giant screen looped through 25 years of photographs. Our wedding, Christmas mornings, family vacations, a lifetime of images that, in that instant, looked like they belonged to two people I no longer recognized. Then I found my son. Noah was 3 years old, standing near the dessert table beside our babysitter, clutching his small stuffed bear so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His blue eyes were huge, confused, searching my face for some explanation an adult could give a child for what he just watched his father do. That look hurt worse than the slap ever could. I bent down close enough that only Richard would hear me. "You didn't just humiliate me tonight," I whispered. "You just taught our son that this is acceptable." Richard rolled his eyes, already bored with me. Margaret, sensing an opening, raised her voice for the benefit of the room. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," she sniffed. "She's always been like this, always trying to ruin a family celebration." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through the crowd, the kind people give when they're relieved someone else has given them permission to laugh. And that was the moment something inside me went completely still. Not rage, not heartbreak, just a quiet, total stop, like a machine finally switched off after running far too long. I looked at my husband one last time. "Okay," I said, just the one word. No scene, no tears, no plea. I picked up my purse, crossed the ballroom floor in my heels, while 300 people watched, took my son's small hand in mine, and walked out. Nobody followed us. My name is Emily Carter. I am 52 years old, and until that night, I had spent most of my adult life believing that enduring humiliation quietly was simply the price of keeping a family whole. I grew up in Rockford, Illinois, the oldest of 3 daughters raised by a school librarian and a firefighter. We didn't have money, but my parents gave us something sturdier. The understanding that respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you're owed, and something you're allowed to walk away from when it's withdrawn. Somehow, over 25 years with Richard, I forgot that lesson completely. I met him when I was 26, freshly hired as a third-grade teacher at a public elementary school outside Chicago. He was easy to like, charming, funny, confident, in that particular way that men raised with money often are. His father had built a successful construction company from nothing. His mother, Margaret, sat on every charity board and church committee worth mentioning in the county. I knew even then that I wasn't from their world. Richard promised it wouldn't matter. My mother will come around, he told me while we were dating. She just needs time. She never did. The first time I visited their home, I brought a homemade pie. Margaret looked at it the way someone examines an unfamiliar insect. "Oh," she said with a small, tight smile. "How quaint." That was the pattern for 25 years. At Thanksgiving, she criticized my cooking. At Christmas, my clothes. When Richard and I bought our first house instead of waiting on one of his parents' investment properties, she called it adorably middle class in front of his entire extended family. Richard always laughed it off the same way. "That's just Mom." Every cruelty came dressed as a joke, and every time I failed to laugh along, I became the one with the problem. Years passed. Richard eventually took over his father's construction business, and our income grew. His income, that is. I stayed in the classroom because I loved teaching children to read, not because it was glamorous. Margaret called it a nice little hobby. Richard never once corrected her. Then 5 years ago, everything we thought we understood about hardship changed. Our daughter Hannah, 22 years old and home from graduate school, was killed by a drunk driver on a rain-slicked highway outside the city. I don't know how to describe the years that followed except to say that grief nearly took our marriage with it. We went to counseling. We had the kind of conversations that either end a marriage or somehow rebuild it into something new. 2 years after we lost Hannah, we made a decision neither of us expected. We adopted. That's how Noah came into our lives, barely a year old, quiet, and so frightened of loud voices that the first night in our home, he refused to let go of my finger while he slept. From that moment, he was my son in every sense that mattered. Margaret never accepted him. She never said it outright. She was too careful for that. Instead, she asked questions. "Do you know anything about his birth family? Children inherit all sorts of things. Blood has a way of revealing itself eventually." Every time she spoke that way, I glanced over at Noah playing on the rug, too young to understand the words, but somehow always old enough to feel the chill behind them. "Mom doesn't mean anything by it," Richard would sigh. "But she did. She always did. So I shouldn't have been surprised when Margaret insisted on planning our 25th anniversary party herself. "It's my gift to you both," she'd announced, and Richard loved the idea so much he never thought to ask what I wanted. She chose the venue, the menu, the flowers, even the guest list. She picked out my dress. "Trust me, dear," she said, holding it up against me like a mannequin. "You clearly need the help." I smiled through all of it, the way I always had. Looking back now, I understand that she had been rehearsing that night for years. The evening began pleasantly enough. Toasts, old friends telling stories, Richard's hand resting warm on my shoulder in a way that almost felt sincere. Then Margaret rose, tapped her glass, and stepped up to the small microphone near the head table. "I'd like everyone to raise a glass," she began, smiling out at the crowd, "to my son, who has always deserved the very best." Applause rippled through the room. She looked directly at me as she continued. "And despite life occasionally handing him unexpected detours, he's managed to build a wonderful life anyway." A few guests shifted in their seats. She laughed lightly. "Let's be honest. We all know Richard married for love, because it certainly wasn't for money or status." The room laughed along with her, uneasy but obedient. Then she turned toward the dessert table, where Noah stood watching everything with wide eyes. And isn't little Noah just adorable? Such a blessing. A small pause, timed perfectly. Though I suppose we can only pray he doesn't inherit whatever unfortunate traits came with his background. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor. The laughter died instantly. Margaret's smile flickered, just for a second, before she recovered it. "Oh," she said sweetly into the microphone. "Did I strike a nerve?" I looked at her, and for the first time in a quarter century, I didn't flinch. "No," I said, calm and clear enough for the whole room to hear. "You've been striking the same nerve for 25 years. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming somewhere above the chandeliers. "I beg your pardon," Margaret said, lowering the microphone slightly. "You heard me." I wasn't shouting. I never needed to. I've spent half my life pretending your comments were jokes. They weren't. They were insults. Every holiday, every birthday, every dinner, reminding me that I would never be good enough for this family. Richard stepped in beside his mother. "Emily," he warned under his breath. I didn't stop. "You've mocked my career. You've mocked my family. You've mocked our son." I turned toward the crowded room. Has anyone here ever heard Margaret say one kind thing about Noah? No one answered. Not one person. Margaret's cheeks flushed a deep red. "I have done no such thing," she gasped, one hand fluttering to her collarbone. Richard grabbed my arm. "That's enough." I pulled away gently. "No, Richard, not this time." Margaret dabbed at imaginary tears. "I opened my heart to this girl 25 years ago." Somewhere behind me, a guest murmured, "Poor Margaret," and I nearly laughed out loud. Poor Margaret, the woman who had spent 2.5 decades quietly dismantling my confidence, one polite insult at a time. Richard leaned in close enough that only I could hear him. "You're making a fool of yourself." "No," I answered quietly. "I'm just refusing to let you make one out of me anymore." That's when he slapped me. Everything that followed happened exactly the way I remember it. The command to apologize or leave, the silence of the room, my single word, "Okay," and then Noah's small hand in mine as we crossed the ballroom floor together and walked out into the night. The drive home felt strangely calm, almost weightless. Noah sat quietly in his car seat hugging his bear, none of his usual chatter filling the car. Somewhere around the halfway point, a small voice broke the silence. "Mommy, did Daddy hit you because you were bad?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I pulled into an empty grocery store parking lot, turned off the engine, and climbed into the back seat beside him. "No, baby, not because of anything you did, or anything I did." "Then why?" I swallowed hard. Sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices. He studied my face with the seriousness only small children can manage. "My teacher says we're not supposed to hit." "Your teacher is right." He reached up and touched my cheek with his small hand. "Does it hurt?" "A little." He leaned forward and kissed the mark gently, the way I'd kissed his scraped knees 100 times. "There." I broke then. Quietly, not dramatically, just wrapping my arms around my son and crying into his small shoulder, while he patted my back the way I'd once comforted him through nightmares. In that parking lot, with the streetlights flickering overhead, I understood something with total clarity. If I stayed, my son might grow up believing that love and fear were supposed to live in the same house. I would not allow that, not for anything. It was nearly midnight when we got home. Richard wasn't there, probably still at the hotel, smoothing things over, pretending nothing serious had happened. I carried Noah upstairs, read him his favorite story until his breathing slowed into sleep, and then walked into the bedroom that had been mine for 25 years. Wedding photographs, anniversary cards, vacation pictures on every dresser. For years I had believed these things were proof of a happy life. That night, they looked like evidence belonging to somebody else's marriage. I opened the closet and pulled out 2 suitcases. Not 4, not 10. 2. One for me, one for Noah. I packed only what mattered. Clothes, birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records, a handful of photographs, Noah's blanket, his bear. The furniture stayed. The jewelry stayed. The china Margaret had insisted we register for stayed exactly where it was. Things were just things. Peace, I was learning, was priceless. At 2 a.m, I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. Emily. The moment she heard my voice, she already knew. I tried to explain and instead just cried. She waited, the way good mothers do, until I could finally get the words out. Then there was a long silence before she said something I hadn't heard her say in years. Come home. I'm 52, Mom. I have a child. I don't even know what tomorrow looks like. I don't need you to know, she said gently. I just need you to come home. For the first time all night, I felt something close to safe. By 6 the next morning, I called the principal at my school and requested emergency leave. She didn't ask questions. Take care of yourself, she said simply. Your classroom will be here when you're ready. By 8:30, I was sitting across from an attorney named Daniel Harper, a friend's longtime recommendation I never expected to need. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he simply folded his hands. The question, he said, isn't whether you can leave. It's whether you're ready to. I already have. Good. Where will you go? Charleston, I said, surprising myself with how quickly the answer came. My mother retired there 5 years ago. A fresh start? No, I said. A peaceful one. By noon, Noah and I were at O'Hare, waiting to board a flight south. He thought we were going on an adventure. In more ways than one, we were. As I buckled his seatbelt, my phone lit up for the first time all morning. Richard, calling, then calling again, then a text. Where are you? Then another. Stop acting childish and come home. I turned the phone face down and didn't reply. Hours later, Richard let himself into a house that had gone quiet. An empty closet, 2 missing suitcases, Noah's room stripped of everything that made it his. On the kitchen counter sat my wedding ring, and beside it, a single folded note with exactly 3 sentences. Richard, you told me to get out. I finally listened. Nothing more. No accusations, no threats, just the truth, finally spoken in ink instead of silence. He called 23 times before our plane landed. 6 voicemails followed. The first irritated, the last one quiet and almost afraid, asking only if Noah was okay. I deleted everyone without listening twice. Not out of hatred, because I had finally learned that peace sometimes begins with silence. Charleston greeted us with the warm sun and salt air. My mother, Linda, was waiting at baggage claim, and the second she saw Noah running toward her, she dropped her purse and opened her arms. My goodness, you've gotten so big. Then she looked at me. One glance at my swollen cheek told her everything she needed to know. She didn't ask a single question. She just held me the way only a mother can, the kind of hug that says you're safe now without a single word. Back in Chicago, Richard's confidence didn't survive the week. He assumed I'd cool off and come back. He even told Margaret so over breakfast. She has nowhere else to go, Margaret said, buttering her toast, unaware that I was already unpacking Noah's clothes 2 states away. By Monday, Richard had called my school, my best friend Karen, everyone he could think of. Karen answered her door with her arms crossed. If she wanted you to know where she was, she'd tell you. The door closed in his face, and for maybe the first time in his life, a door actually stayed closed. Meanwhile, Daniel filed the first paperwork and gave me the calmest advice I'd ever received. Don't argue with him. Don't defend yourself. Save every message he sends. When I asked what to do if Richard apologized, Daniel said simply, wait until his actions match his words. 3 days after the party, a video surfaced. Not the slap, but everything leading up to it. Margaret's toast, the comment about Noah, the uneasy laughter, my face, Richard saying nothing at all. One of his younger cousins had recorded it and without thinking much of it, uploaded a short clip. It spread through the family group chats, then church circles, then a local community page before someone thought better of it and took it down. By then it didn't matter. Enough people had already seen it. The reaction wasn't what Margaret expected. Comment after comment asked the same question. Why would anyone speak to their daughter-in-law that way? Someone wrote that the little boy standing there watching was the part that broke their heart. Another comment, shared hundreds of times, put it plainly. Silence is agreement. The husband is just as guilty. Richard read every word. For the first time, he saw himself the way strangers saw him. Not as a successful businessman, but as a man who had let his wife be humiliated in public and said nothing. His business noticed too. A regional construction company built over 40 years by his father depended on reputation, and reputation, it turned out, doesn't recover as quickly as a bank account does. A longtime client delayed signing a contract. Another asked to wait until things settle. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to make Richard uneasy in a way money alone couldn't fix. This is ridiculous, he complained to his mother. People love gossip, Margaret said, waving a hand. They'll forget. They didn't. A week later, an email arrived from the Charleston School District. A literacy coordinator had retired unexpectedly, and my mother had quietly mentioned my background to an old colleague. The position wasn't guaranteed, but they wanted to talk. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours, and not once did anyone ask what my husband did for a living, or what my last name meant in certain circles. They asked about reading programs, about mentoring new teachers, about children from difficult backgrounds. 2 days later, they offered me the job, and when I signed the contract, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride, earned entirely on my own. Richard, meanwhile, hired a private investigator, not out of concern for our safety, but because he genuinely couldn't find us. 11 days after I left, the report arrived on his desk. My new address in Charleston, Noah's preschool enrollment, my new position with the district, and one final line that stopped him cold. Mrs. Carter appears to have permanently relocated. Permanently. Until that moment, he'd believed this was a phase, a punishment, something that would resolve itself if he simply waited long enough. Margaret walked into his office and asked if they'd found us. She's gone, he said quietly. So? He looked up at his mother for a long moment. You don't understand, he said. I didn't lose an argument. I lost my family. For the first time in his life, Margaret had nothing clever to say. 4 months after we arrived in Charleston, a letter came. Not from Richard, not from Margaret, but from a woman named Susan who had been at the party. We'd never been close. Her family had known Richards through church for years. Inside was a short, handwritten apology. She admitted she'd laughed along with everyone else that night, not because she found any of it funny, but because it was easier than standing apart from the crowd. She was ashamed she hadn't spoken up, and she hoped I'd found peace. I folded the letter and kept it in my desk drawer. It didn't undo what had happened, but it taught me something worth remembering. Sometimes people don't join cruelty because they're cruel. Sometimes they simply lack the courage to stand apart from it. Either way, the damage lands the same. Life in Charleston slowly became something wonderfully ordinary. Every morning, Noah and I walked to preschool together before I drove to the district office. Every afternoon, I came home tired but proud of work I'd chosen for myself. My coworkers cared about effort, not appearances. Within a few months, I was helping schools across the district build a literacy program for struggling readers, and every evening felt like something I'd actually built with my own hands. Richard, meanwhile, was learning that money solves fewer problems than he'd once believed. Employees who'd watched the video began treating him differently. Nothing overt, just a quiet erosion of the easy respect he'd taken for granted his whole life. Margaret refused to see any of it clearly, still telling anyone at church who'd listen that I had kidnapped Noah, until even Richard started correcting her. "He's our son, Mom. She had every right to take him." It was, in its own small way, the first time in 25 years he defended me at all, even if it came too late to matter to our marriage. One rainy Saturday, Richard sat down and watched the entire 45-minute recording of that night, not just the short clip that had circulated. He watched his mother's comments land one after another. He watched the guests laugh nervously. He watched me smile politely through each one. And he noticed something he'd apparently never seen before. Every single time Margaret insulted me, I looked at him just for a second, hoping he'd finally say something. He never did. When the slap came, he paused the video and stared at the frozen image of his own hand, then rewound it and watched it again and again. He started seeing a counselor after that, not to save the marriage he later admitted, but because he could no longer recognize the man he'd become. In one session, his counselor asked him plainly, "When did you start putting your mother's approval above your wife's well-being?" Richard didn't have an answer, not because he didn't know, but because the truth was that it had started long before we were ever married. One afternoon, Daniel called with the news. Richard had agreed to every temporary custody arrangement without a fight, and accepted the financial disclosures without objection. Surprising, Daniel admitted, from a man who'd never liked losing. His attorney had mentioned one more thing. Richard wanted to apologize in person if I was willing. "I don't think I'm ready," I told Daniel. "You don't have to be," he said. "And if you never are, that's your choice too." It was, I realized, the first time in years anyone had reminded me that the choice was actually mine. Autumn arrived, and the oaks around my mother's neighborhood turned gold and crimson. One Saturday, while Noah and I painted a little wooden birdhouse in the backyard, a text came through from an unfamiliar number. Richard's younger brother, Michael, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "I know we haven't talked in a long time. I just wanted you to know you were right. We all should have stopped her. I'm sorry." I answered with 4 words. "Thank you for saying that." Nothing more was needed. A week after that, Daniel called again to say Richard would be in Charleston on business the following Friday, and he was asking for 30 minutes. No lawyers, no pressure, just a chance to apologize face to face. I sat with the request for a long moment. For months, I had imagined this conversation 100 different ways, most of them involving raised voices and old wounds reopened. Instead, I felt something closer to calm settle over me. Maybe revenge was never about watching someone suffer. Maybe it was simply the moment you realized you no longer needed it. I looked across the yard at Noah, laughing as he painted the birdhouse a bright, careless blue, and I finally understood that our future had grown bigger than our past. "Tell him 30 minutes, I said. The following Friday was cool and bright, one of those perfect Charleston mornings when the breeze carries the smell of salt water through the live oaks. I chose a small park by the marina, wooden benches, ducks, retirees walking their dogs, a quiet place, exactly what I wanted. My mother stayed home with Noah. As I kissed him goodbye, he looked up at me. "Are you coming back?" "Always." "Okay," he said, and hugged my leg. That single word carried me straight back to another one I'd spoken 4 months earlier, walking out of a ballroom. This time, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like freedom. Richard was already waiting when I arrived, and I almost didn't recognize him. Thinner, older, not from gray hair, but from the particular way regret ages a person. He stood as I approached. "Thank you for coming." "You have 30 minutes, I said, sitting across from him. He reached into his jacket and set my wedding ring on the table between us. "I found it after you left. I've carried it ever since. I thought you should have it." I didn't reach for it. "I don't want it. It stopped being mine the night I left." He pulled his hand back slowly. "I understand." And for the first time in 25 years, I believed that he actually did. "I've replayed that night 1,000 times, he said. I kept telling myself the slap was the biggest mistake of my life. He shook his head. It wasn't. The biggest mistake was every time my mother insulted you and I laughed along, every holiday, every birthday, every dinner, asking you to keep the peace. All I was really asking was for you to keep accepting disrespect. I let him say it. He'd earned the right to say it out loud, finally, after so many years of silence. I failed you, he went on, his voice breaking. I failed Hannah while she was alive. I failed Noah. I failed myself. I became exactly the kind of man I always promised I'd never become. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. A young couple walked past pushing a stroller, the father quietly tucking a blanket around the baby without a word. Such an ordinary act of care. I found myself wondering how many small, ordinary moments like that I had spent years hoping for and never received. I've been seeing a counselor, Richard said. Good. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect another chance. I only wanted you to know that you were right to leave. I studied his face carefully. Months earlier, I would have hunted for the manipulation hiding underneath his words. I found none this time, only sorrow, real and plain. I do forgive you, I said finally. He looked up, startled. You do? I forgive you because I refuse to carry this pain for the rest of my life. I paused, but forgiveness isn't the same thing as going back. The hope drained slowly from his face, but he nodded. I understand. I'm trying to build something peaceful. So am I said. I hope you keep trying. I will. Before we parted, he asked one last question. Will I get to see Noah? He's your son, I said gently. I'd never keep him from a father willing to become the man he deserves. But understand something. If you ever make him feel the way you made me feel, you won't get another chance. You have my word, he said. And for the first time, I believed him. Not because of what he'd said, but because he'd finally learned to take responsibility instead of building an excuse around it. A month later, a letter arrived from Margaret. Her handwriting trembled across the page. She confessed that she'd spent most of her life believing money and status determined a person's worth, and that she'd never truly accepted me, because I reminded her of the modest life she'd spent decades trying to outrun. Then came the line that surprised me most. I taught my son that loyalty to me mattered more than respect for his wife. I was wrong. She apologized, not just for the anniversary party, but for 25 years. I didn't call her, and I didn't write back right away. Some apologies deserve to be acknowledged. That doesn't mean every relationship deserves to be rebuilt. A few weeks later, I sent a short reply. I accept your apology. I truly hope you find peace. I have. It was enough. Over the following 2 years, Richard became, against all my old expectations, a dependable father. He flew down once a month, showed up for preschool graduation, soccer games, birthday parties, and never once asked me to come back. Slowly, carefully, we learned how to be respectful co-parents. Nothing more, nothing less, and it turned out that was more than enough. As for me, I kept working with schools across South Carolina, helping children discover the particular joy of finally being able to read a book on their own. Every night, Noah and I still read together before bed. One evening, after we'd finished his favorite story, he looked up at me. Mommy, why do you always tell me to be kind? I brushed the hair from his forehead. Because kindness means the most when you show it to people who can't give you anything back for it. He smiled. I want to be kind like you. I kissed his forehead. Then you're already becoming the man I hoped you'd be. Looking back now, I don't think leaving was the bravest thing I ever did. The bravest thing was refusing to let bitterness write the rest of my story. People sometimes ask if I regret walking away from a 25-year marriage. My answer never changes. I didn't walk away from love. I walked away from disrespect, and once I did, I finally found my way home. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this: no relationship is worth the price of your dignity. Love should never ask you to accept humiliation as the cost of staying. And walking away from disrespect was never weakness. It was, and still is, the bravest form of courage I know.